And thank you so much for coming down.
Thank you.
All right, Billy Bishoff.
Senator Zirkin and committee, I'm Billy Bishoff. I would like to point out the Maryland Farm Bureau has submitted written testimony opposing this bill. I'm here representing the Garrett County Farm Bureau and the Energy and Property Coalition, and we are opposing this bill. We could agree on one thing, and that would be that this industry needs to be well regulated. What we're disagreeing with completely is the process that you're going about to do it. I was at one of the commission meetings where Bridget Kinney discussed this liability issue. And I am concerned, Senator Zirkin, that you describe the balance of justice much differently than she does. And really alarmed that the Attorney General describes the balance of justice much differently than she does. In her words, when MDE grants a permit to an operator, I
think that may have been from the previous one.
Okay. They assume guardianship of that project. And if any regulations are not observed by the operator, MDE picks up the torch and goes after the companies. That is the balance of power. They ask for presumption of liability for limited resources within a year because the problems associated with fracking usually show up within a year. But their guardianship extends for the entire length of the permit, whether that's 20 years or 30 years. We have been trying for the last 4 or 5 years to build a box around this process. You have pointed out instances in other states where it seems like the box was a little leaky. One of the primary tools to plug these leaks, I think, would be a year's baseline testing of the water ahead of time. I'm not aware of any case in another state where actually frack water or salty water or fracking constituents showed up in a well and a regulatory agency didn't go after that company. Where it gets leaky is where maybe the water just turned gray after drilling. And the property owner says, my water didn't used to be gray. And the state comes in and tests it and says, well, there's nothing else wrong with it except it's gray. So that's where this concept of pre-baseline testing comes in, so that we have a direct chain of evidence that before drilling, the water was not gray. After the drilling, the water is gray, and it gives MDE the tools to go after these irregularities. And I agree with you. There is nobody that should have less quality water when drilling is done than they had when it started. We agree on that completely, and the industry can abide by that.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Senator Raskin has a question for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much for your testimony today.
Sure.
There's an interesting proposition afoot, which I think you articulated well, and I want to put this to the test a little bit. The suggestion is that as long as the state regulates it and imposes regulations, then there really should be no further liability put on the fracking industry. It's between the state and the companies that engage in fracking. The problem is that leaves out one very important element, which is all of the people who live in the state. So let me make an analogy for you. So the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration engages in some regulations regarding automobiles. And the federal government generally has, there's seatbelt requirements, and there's different things there. And so it's a regulated industry. But if there's a defect, a manufacturing defect like in the ignition that like General Motors is going through now, we hold them as a matter of product liability strictly liable to the people. If the car stops in the middle of the highway or blows up or whatever, the people sue them on a strict liability basis, despite the fact that they're a regulated industry. And, the government doesn't always do its job. Or, look at the disaster in the coal mine explosion in West Virginia, where 29 coal miners were killed, right? And there had been hundreds of regulatory citations that the industry just thumbed their nose at and, ignored. But when the coal mine blew up and killed all of those people, they became strictly liable to the families of the victims who were killed. And I mean, isn't that right that we can have a regulatory regime, but that is not preclusive of standards of legal liability that attach to the company vis-a-vis the public?
I am so happy you brought this up because it brings together the issues of strict liability, people, and risk. If you've got an ignition system that malfunctions, you have a testable defect that you can prove what it is. But you just give strict liability to people. You've got dozens or hundreds of letters from people who already think they're sick from hydraulic fracturing. And you all know that that's not true. And yet you're giving them the legal standing that assuming that they're right. No, they're not right. This is like the old-timers used to tell me, assume that your wife is always right. Give her strict liability. Now, we've all been married, and we know that that doesn't necessarily work out quite all the time because sometimes she's wrong. So how many people sitting around us today, even if they're your best friends, would you give them strict liability on you?
Well, now that I've got half of the state on my side, let me work for the other half. The proposition you just made was very interesting because what you said was there are people who live within the fracking danger zone, as we've defined it, who already think that they're getting sick. And you said, we know that's not true. Speaking for myself, that statement is false. I don't know that's not true, but you do seem to know it's not true. In other words, you take the position that they could not have gotten sick from fracking, even if they live within that vicinity.
Sir, there's no fracking in Maryland.
Forgive me. Under our legislation, we would presume if they're within the danger zone, they got sick that way, but they would still need to prove causation. And if they couldn't prove causation, and your company could negate that, could rebut the presumption, then you'd be off the hook. But you seem to be saying they shouldn't even have the opportunity to get into court. Isn't that right?
There are people who think they're sick from fracking, and it doesn't even exist in Maryland. Yes, you've got letters of people, from people, who presume that they're going to get sick if there's fracking in Maryland.
Okay, but well, you seem to presume that nobody, are you telling me nobody's ever gotten sick from fracking?
Absolutely not. I'm just saying that if you truly get sick, or if there is a measurable irregularity in the regulations, MDE will go after that company.
But see, that's my point. Now you're back on the regulatory track.
Sure,
and we know for a lot of people, like the coal miners in West Virginia, that didn't help. And for people whose cars blow up, that doesn't necessarily help. People also have rights within the system of civil liability outside of the regulatory process. And you seem to think that the fracking companies should get off of the hook simply because they're regulated. And that doesn't follow for me. And I'm wondering, what's your basis for saying that just because they're regulated, they should have no civil liability towards people who live in civil society?
All right, let's deal with the Sago mine disaster, which you're relating to. That came down to an error of people. There are 3 entries that entered that mine. Those miners walked out to the first one. It was blocked. They turned around. They walked out to the second one. It was blocked. They sat down and waited to die. They didn't walk out the third entrance, which was open. When the rescuers went in, they were not blocked in that mine.
Wait, just to get it straight, it was the miners' fault that they were killed? No, I just want to get the point straight. Are you saying that the mine workers who were buried...
You're ignoring the reason that they were killed.
What was the reason? I'm not following. What was the reason?
Is that they stayed in the mine so long that their devices, their safety devices, ran out of air. There was no reason they had to stay in the mine. They were equipped with safety devices to walk out of the mine, and they didn't walk out. Well, what do you mean, wow? How do you operate an industry and deal with this?
Well, but let me, I'm no expert on it, but I do know that there were literally hundreds of federal and state citations against the mining company that were ignored by the corporation, and they have settled for millions of dollars with the families of the victims. So yes. I never heard before your testimony that the fault was that of the mine workers.
I'm saying it was human error.
Okay. So, well, what do we do with the human error that takes place within large corporations, whether they're auto manufacturers or coal mines or fracking companies, that then cause grievous harm to people who are not positioned to bear the cost or the risk and had no opportunity to prevent the injury in the first place?
Sir, you're talking about a world that doesn't exist, and that's one without risk.
The whole question is, where do you allocate the risk? And I think the purpose of the legislation that the chairman has introduced is to say that the people who are best positioned to manage the risk and prevent injury are the people who should be legally responsible. And I have not heard a really successful refutation of that idea. Why should the people who live in the neighborhood, who live in the community, why should they bear the risk as opposed to the company?
I'm not saying... We're getting down to the idea of risk and allocating it. You're saying that these people... There is no way to do any process without some risk. If you get your oil from the Middle East, you're incurring risk. If you get it from the Arctic, you're incurring risk. I don't know how to run our lives the way we run it today without any risk, and that's what you're asking to do.
Well, I thank you very much for your testimony, because I think it does put our attention on the right issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony.
Okay.